You've been putting on the miles, haven't you?
Indeed, indeed. And it's not going to get better because in 2 weeks, Yossi Philip is making a wedding.
Hmm. What's the date?
I think it's the 7th or the 8th.
Oh,
Okay, here we go. So yesterday, we were learning about the machlokes if nois and tam lufgam is also or not. So you have heter. So let's say you have a pot of some type of thing that's cooking. You have a pot of chicken soup, and in it falls some
there's something wrong with the.
nevela. But the nevela is
You hear me?
not.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
There's something wrong with you. The
Is it,
projection of the daf. First of all, I see three pictures of you.
1 second. What are you seeing now?
Okay,
Oh,
I see one, two,
okay. So let me
three,
try this
four.
again. Okay,
Yeah,
I see
I
what's
don't
going
see
on.
the blot.
Let's try this. Is this better?
1 minute, it's not up yet. There we go. Yeah.
Is that better?
Yep.
Okay. So yesterday we were discussing Roshin Tam of Gam. So you have, let's say, a pot of chicken soup, and into it falls a piece of nevela, but the nevela does not give it a good taste. Does that make it that it's mutter or is it still usher? And we had a machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon about it. Gemara wanted to know, Reb Meir who holds nois and tam of gam is usher, where did he get it from? He looked Gemara, he got it from Giulei Nachum. Because Baruch Hu told Klal Yisrael that they have to kasher all their pots, the pots that they got from the Midrash. Chances are those pots were not used that day. At least many of the pots weren't used that day. Yet the Torah tells us that we have to kasher them. If it's a day old, the Gemara even said, even if it's the same day, even if it's the same day, there's always in the blias, there's always some noise in Tam of Gam, there's some factor of noise in Tam of Gam. Yet the Torah tells us that you have to kasher them, so that's right. The noise in Tam of Gam is also. Now, noise in Tam of Gam does not mean that it's such a bad taste that it makes the food that absorbed it inedible. Of course, it's still edible. It just means that it doesn't add to the dish. It subtracts from the dish. But of course, it's edible, but it's still called nois and tamil kam. So the makar of Meir, that it's also is from Gi'ul Nachum. Now, how does Reb Shimon know? How does Reb Shimon know that nois and tamil kam is mutter? So he learns it from Nevela, because it says in the pasuk, if someone has Nevela, they shouldn't eat it. Lager asher b'sharecha, you should give it to a ger. So Reb Shimon, if the Torah says you should give it to a ger, it only has a shem iser if it's edible for a ger. But if it's not edible for a ger, then it's not considered iser. And that takes us to the very top of our Amma today. She'einu ru'il ger, einu kri nevela. It's not called nevela. For Reb Meir, so Reb Meir who holds even though Talmud Gam is Aser, how is he going to understand the pasuk by the Vela? Zok Gemara hula mu'ute serucha meikar. As Rashi tells us, it's mukashchin mechaim. You know what we learn from the pasuk of Nevela, that only if it's edible? That means if the animal, even before it died, if it was a mukashchin, it was a disgusting animal that nobody would have thought of eating, the hoil ve'ifkama mikoidim shabbat de Nevela, if it was already not edible, even before it died and became nevela, then loichal shem nevela aleh. Then it won't become a nevela. Aval hecho the itzer meikara. But if when it dies, it's in good condition and it dies, then it remains in its Isser state. Therefore, Sulei Paka Isser Mishum Pagam. The fact that the meat goes off a little bit will not take away the Isser Nevela. So Rav Meir, Hahula Mute, Srucha Meikara. So then the question is, Rab Shimon, how does Rab Shimon know that Srucha Meikara is not Asher Mishum Nevela? Rab Shimon, Srucha Meikara, Lo Shricha Meyuta. For that, I don't know the pasuk. So Rab Shimon, Afra Ba'almahu. That's not even called food, Isser. It's just earth, because it's rotten meat. And it came from a rotten animal. That's something that doesn't need a pasuk to say that it's mutter. Period. So now we have our machlokes between Rab Shimon and Rab Meir, and now the Gemara probes under what circumstances are they arguing. So Amar Ula. Ula comes up first and says as follows: machlokes, the whole machlokes, where there's even a possibility that Rab Meir would say even nois and tam of gam should aser, is only sheshpiach ulu b'sayf pugam. That's only if when the Isser fell into the heter, at that moment it helped, it was a benefit to the heter. Later on, it turned bad. That's when Reb Meir holds nois and tam of gam is also. Avopoga meikara, if from the first moment that the Isser enters the mixture, it was only subtracting from the mixture, divrei koil mutter. Everybody would agree that that's mutter. So we've just limited the chumer of Reb Meir. Reb Meir, who holds nois and tam of gam is also, it's not in all locations. It's only if there was some point where it was l'shvach, and then, well, I shouldn't say l'shvach, only if at one point it was good, it was not poigim, and then it turned bad. Esvei Rab Chaga Ula. So Rab Chaga asked Ula a kasha from a brayta that we're familiar with, from a mishnah that we're familiar with. Yain shenafal l'soich adoshim, which doesn't, yain does not help adoshim. B'chaymet shenafal l'toich grisen, and vinegar that fell into grisen. Again, these are things that the Mishnah identifies as nois and tam of gam. Osir, they become osir. So here you have a perfect example of something that's poigim meikara. When the chaymet fell into the grisen, the yain fell into the adoshim, who was poigim meikara. Yet the Talakama, who we know is Reb Meir, says also Reb Shimon Matir, v'hahacha, Reb Chaga, v'hahacha, the pagam meikar. The moment the wine falls into the adoshim and the chaymitz into the grisim, it's not adding a good taste; it's adding a bad taste. Upligi, and you still see the machlokes, so you still see Reb Meir clearly demonstrates his shita that is also, even if it's pagam mitchila. Omar Ula told him, Chaga, what is wrong with you? Loi Meida Yoda my Karmi Rabbanon. You don't know what the Rabbanon are talking about? And Yufta Kamoisev, you're asking me a kasha? Don't you remember how we explained this Mishnah? Hachabamayas Kagoin Shenofal Latoich Grisen Tsoinen. When the vinegar fell into the grisen, everything was cold and raw. At that point, it's only a shvach. They're sicha. Then you cook them up. And when you cook them up, now when they're hot, it's bad for it. It doesn't taste good. And then you eat it all the way at the end when it cools off again. So therefore we say, Nasha Kamisha Shpiachulu B'Soif Pagam V'Osir. That brisa, or that Mishnah that you, Rab Chaga, want to bring a raya from, there are Meir, Asers, even Pagam, from the beginning, that's not what the Mishnah is talking about. The Mishnah is talking about when the chaymitz fell in to the grisen, they were cold, and at that point it's mishabeach, and it only became poigim later. So you don't have a raya that Reb Meir would argue an aser even if the pekam was lechatchila. Now we had this same comment yesterday, and I don't think I mentioned Tosfos' kasha there, because this Gemara's lashon is very unusual. The Gemara's lashon is Nasa Kamisha Shpiachol B'Soif Pagam. Since you put the vinegar into the grisen when they were cold, we treat it as if when the vinegar originally entered the grisen, it was good. Correct, Tosfos? What do you mean we treat it as if? That's exactly what it is. Exactly what it is B'Shabeach B'Soif Pagam. So why does the Gemara use the lashon of Nasa Kami? It's not Nasa Kami. So this is a Meforsha Tosfos on Samach Zayin Amud Aleph. So I'm going to just turn back for a minute to Samach Zayin Amud Aleph. And we're going to look at the second Tosfos at the top of the Amud. Nasa Kamisha Shpiach. Zok Tosfos Tema. Amai Noket Hai Lishna. What do you mean? It's as if it was Mishpiach. That's exactly what's happening. The vinegar originally is an addition to benefit to the greasing. The Eshloimers Zok Tosfos, because even after, when you put the vinegar in originally, everything's raw. You haven't cooked it yet. So the cold greasing that we say are good with vinegar, that means you mixed it when it was cold. Then you heated it up and it was no good. And then you wait till it cools down, and that's when it's good. So therefore it's because when you're pouring the vinegar on the cold raw greasing, that's not really a shvach because you can't eat it at that point. It becomes edible after it cools down, after you heated it up. So that's why the Gemara uses a lotion of nasa kami. Let's go back to our daf. So up to the Gemara. So Ula deflected Reb Chagva's kasha, and he said that clearly we only have a raya from here that Reb Meir argues only if it was a shbiach of soif pagim. But if it was pagim lechatchila, Reb Meir would be moida that it would not aser. It's up to Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan argued on Ula, and he said bepagim meikara machlokes. Reb Meir is even arguing bepagim meikara, which is a chiddush, because at no point did this iser ever add anything to the mixture, because when it fell in, it was pagimit, and even there, Reb Meir holds it aser. So, frank the Gemara, aval hishpiach l'b'soif pagam. What if it was a shpiach l'b'soif pagam? Are we saying that divrei hakoil aser, that even Reb Shimon would be mighty that it's aser, and they're only arguing in a case of pagim meikara? Or maybe bein bezu ubein bezu machlekes, or maybe they're arguing in both cases. So the chiddush is that Reb Shimon holds that it's not going to aser even if it was a shpiach of psach pagim, and the chiddush in Reb Meir is that it will aser even if it's pagim lechatchila. Having the Gemara with a teku. It is interesting that the Gemara uses the word teku because over the next couple of lines in the Gemara, over the next Amud, we're going to see that the Gemara does bring a raya to be poshet to Shaila. But at this point, the Gemara says teku. We don't know if their machlokes is only by pagim l'chatchila or even if it's by shpiach or pagam. So really, the Shaila is Reb Shimon. Reb Meir holds psai pagam l'chatchila and psai hishpiach or pagam is aser. The question is Reb Shimon, who holds pagam l'chatchila, is mutter. Would he also be mater if it was a shpiach of pagam? Amar Reb Amram. Sotr Amram. The way you're learning Rabbi Yochanan, Reb Meir is a massive chiddush, because even if it's pagam l'chatchila, the iser never impacted positively the mixture that it fell into. Even there, Reb Meir is going to say that it's aser. That's a huge chiddush. After Yisrael had Rabbi Yochanan, v'loitanya lo b'masnisen, how could you suggest such a huge chiddush in Reb Meir was never mentioned beferish in the Mishnah? We're going to see that we'll be able to make diyukim from the Mishnah to prove that Reb Meir says that even pagim mitchila is aser. But it behooves the Mishnah to say it beferish if in fact that chiddush is true. That Reb Meir holds that even pagim mitchila is asering, that has to be beferish. So they looked nofak dok v'ashka. They went and they left the Beis Medrash where the Amoraim used to learn, where they didn't even have a printed set of Mishnayos there, because at Nishka Past, it was expected that all the Amoraim would know Mishnayos, all of Mishnayos Bapeh. And they went into the Aguda where they had the Meshivta Gemara, the Art Scroll, where the Melamdim are embarrassed to look in, but now in the Aguda at night after Mar, they can look in, and that's how they found the Mishnah of Ashkach, and they found the Mishnah that in fact tells us beferish that Reb Meir holds even pagim mitchila is going to be aser. And this is what the Mishnah says. Sa'ar shal chulin shenafal l'toicha isa v'yesh by l'kidei l'hachmitz. Some yeast of chulin fell into a isa of chulin, and there was enough yeast to make the whole dough rise. And in fact, the dough rise. So far, there's no problem yet. But after the dough rise, the achigach nafal sa'or shel truma or shel klei keren v'yesh ba kedei lahachmitz, and then another unit of yeast fell in. Either it was truma. So the question is, will it make the entire dough truma, or it was klei keren, which is aser ba'ana? Will it make the entire dough aser? V'yesh ba kedei lahachmitz, and it also was able to be machmitz. The halach is it's aser. Now, the halacha, the fact is that if you're supposed to use 2 ounces of yeast and you use 4 ounces of yeast, it's going to it's going to over ferment the dough, and you won't be able to eat that dough anymore. So that's going to make it bad. So zog to Gemara, if first the isa was already hukmatz from the sa'or of chulin, and only afterwards sa'or shel truma fell in, which sounds like it's a case of pogumei kara, osir, it will be osir. Reb Shimon Matir. Zok to Gemara, this is a case of pogumei kara. The hacha the pogumei karahu, because the moment they put this second dose of yeast in it, it already makes the dough no good. You won't be able to eat this dough anymore. It's not good anymore. It's over yeasted. And nevertheless, we see Reb Meir holds that it's osir. So you have a raya to Rabbi Yochanan Shita, where you see beferish Reb Meir held that pogum meikaran is going to be awesome. Amar Abzer, it's not a raya because shiny isa hoil uruya lechameya ba kama isa sacheris. Agreed. The moment you put this yeast into the dough, you over yeasted. The dough is not edible anymore. But the dough now has a tremendous value, not to eat it. But now this entire dough will take on the form of yeast, and you can use this dough as yeast for other breads. So now you have 100 servings of yeast that you can now use. So yes, it lost its positive properties to be able to eat it, but it's gained some phenomenal properties that now you've made the entire dough into yeast, which is very, very valuable. So now we see, according to Reb Zera, there's a new machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon. The machlokes is, when you look at pagam, do you look at pagam only legabe its achila, or do you look at the big picture? According to Reb Meir, you look at the big picture. The way we want to say over here, you look at the big picture, and therefore it's considered a shvach, and therefore it's going to be usher. This is not a question of pogum meikari. This is a question is it a shvach or is it a pgam? So we're learning that it's considered a shvach, and therefore if it's considered a shvach, that's why it asks. So the question will be, why would Reb Shimon be matir? Because Reb Shimon holds you look at its properties legabe achila, and therefore legabe achila it was pogum. So Reb Meir holds you look at the big picture, even though the extra yeast makes it that you can't eat this dough, but it brings some other advantages to this dough. This dough now could be machmitz other doughs, therefore it's called that it's mishabech. And Shimon holds, since you could no longer eat it, it's called pogum. So this whole shaila, according to Reb Zera, is not a question of pogum will b'soif shpiach or shpiach will b'soif pogum. It's a uniform case. You put the yeast in. According to Reb Meir, that's called being mishabechet, and that's why it's osir, because you could use it as other yeast, to yeast other doughs. And according to Reb Shimon, since you can no longer eat it, it's called a pogum. It would be a completely different discussion. Once again, we don't have a Mishnah or Brisa that says explicitly that Reb Meir asers even if it's pogum meikar. So Tashma, let's try another Brisa. So Ar shel truma vishel chulin shenaflu l'toicha isa. Sa'ar of truma and of chulin. So a unit of sa'ar of truma, a piece of yeast that was truma, and a piece of yeast that was chulin, simultaneously, Dr. Rashi, fell in to an isa. And bozek kedei lahachmitz, ubozek kedei lahachmitz. Both of these yeasts, independent of the other, was enough of a shear to be machmitz the whole dough. So basically, you put in double the amount of yeast. The recipe calls for 2 ounces of yeast, and you put in 4 ounces of yeast, 2 of which were chulin and 2 of which were truma. V'chimtu, and of course they did a great job. And now this dough became very, very fermented. It's able to rise. Aser, the halacha is it will be aser. Rab Shimon mater, and Rab Shimon would be mater. So Rashi explains this case. Nofal shel truma tchila divrei hakoil aser. I'm sorry, that's the second case. So let's look at the first case. So Ar shel truma. So the fifth Rashi from the bottom of the Amud. So Ar shel truma v'shel chulin shenaflu biyachad l'soicha isa. They fell simultaneously into the isa. V'yesh b'chol echad kidei lechametz. Each yeast alone could have done the trick. So now Rashi gives us a key of what's happening up here. Since you put too much yeast in, of course, we learned that messes up the dough. It's not good. So at this point, we're looking at it, that it was pugiment right away. Rabbi Shimon matter, shepagmu, it was pugiment. Okay. And Rabbi Meir holds it's going to be asur. So that's the first case. We're gonna get back to this soon. The next case was Nofal shel truma tchila. What if first the 2 ounces of truma fell in, then divrei hakoil aser, then everybody holds that it's aser because the truma fell there first. Why is that? So Rashi, an important point. Hoil umashpicha betchila. When the yeast of truma fell in, there was no yeast of chulin there. So that yeast was just the right amount of yeast for this dough. So it's definitely mishabeach the dough. Now Rashi introduces a very important point. When you added a second dose of yeast, shal you don't look at it that only the chulin was pugiment, but the sa'ar of the truma was fully good. No, because when you put in too much yeast, now both servings of this yeast, the 2 ounces from the truma, together with the 2 ounces of the chulin, they're working together to be pugiment. So therefore, this will be considered a case of mashpiach ulebesoy pogum, and therefore it's going to be aser. So this is demonstrating that by hishpiach ulebesoy pogum, what is it saying? Everybody holds it would be aser, right? Nofal shel truma tchila divra koil aser. That's a case of a shpiach ulebesoy pogum, because when the truma was there by itself, it was a shpiach. When it was joined by the extra dose of sa'ar of chulin, together these 2 doses create a pekam. So this is a case of a shpiach ulebesoy pogum. So this should right away jump up in our heads that it seems to be a riot that Reb Shimon is moida in the case of a shpiach ulebesoy pogum. If Reb Meir is moida in the case of a shpiach ulebesoy pogum that it's aser, so then where is Reb Meir arguing? The only possibility for Reb Meir to be arguing is in the case of pugim tchila. So technically, from right over here, we have a riot that Reb Meir asers even was pugim tchila. But that doesn't satisfy our need, because the Gemara said, Reb Amram said, this is something, if Reb Meir holds that by pugim tchila, it's aser, that's such a big chiddush, a diak isn't enough for the Mishnah to tell us this chiddush. Such a chiddush would have to be stated explicitly in the case of pugim tchila. We need to see that Reb Meir asers, not from a diak. Although this diak adequately illustrates that point as well, because if even if Shimon holds its aser by hishpiach ulebesoy pogum, the only place where the machlokes could be would be by pugim tchila. So that's the first point we need to know. The second point we need to know is Rashi's kasha. Ulekamon paruch. The Gemara on the basis asked the following kasha. Imkein reishinami Reb Shimon harei shpiach shel truma im shel chulin tchila. The first case where the sa'ar of the chulin fell in together simultaneously with the sa'ar of truma, that should also be a case of a shpiach ulebesoy pogum. Because if you over yeast, what happens? It starts to ferment more quickly. But right when it begins to start fermenting, it's going to be good then. It's only later on in the process, as the chemical reaction continues, then it becomes too much. So oivazoi, that should also be considered like a case of a shpiach ulebesoy pogum, where even Reb Shimon should be moided that it's awesome. So that kasha the Gemara is going to deal with on Hamid Beis. Zok the Gemara. The third case is the case where we're looking to bring our raya from, where we want to claim that it's explicit that your mayor holds that pogum may korai is going to be Asr. And that is as follows. Nofel shal chulin. The achagach nofel shal truma. If first the Sa'ar of chulin fell in, and then the Sa'ar of truma fell in, Oy shal klayaker, that's Asr. There, when the second dose fell in, the dose of truma, the dose of Isser, that was only damaging the dough because it already had enough yeast from chulin. Nevertheless, Asr, Meir says it's Asr for Shimon Matir. Zogti Gemara, v'yahocha the pagamekar. As soon as the second dose of yeast, the Isser, fell in, it was bad for the dough. Upligi, and you see a machlokes, meaning, and your Meir holds it will be Asr. Frank the Gemara, what type of raya do you have? We just had Reb Zera, who diffused that raya. V'chitema hachanami, because Reb Zera, if you're going to be able to deflect this raya like Reb Zera, who says that that's not damaging the dough at all, rather it's helping the dough, because now the dough, although it's not edible, but it could still now be used to add yeast to other doughs, to Reb Zera. So therefore, it's a case of a shpiach. That's where Meir holds it's Asr. Tashmami Seifa. You know what? There's even another case in the Brisa that we could prove that Reb Meir holds Poigim L'Chatchila is going to be Asr. What does it say in this Brisa? Hayayin shenafal l'toich hadoshim, the chaymet shenafal l'toich grisim, Asr. And at this point, we're going to assume that it's Poigim B'Tchila, Reb Shimon Matir. So b'hahachanami, this is a case of yayin shenafal l'toich hadoshim, the Poigim Meikar, it's Poigim right away, upligi, and yet Reb Meir still holds it's Asr. V'chitemi tomorrow, you're going to slug up my raya because we just had Ula and Amar Aleph who diffused this raya. Hachanami kedeshani le Ula le Reb Chaga. What did Ula tell Reb Chaga? That's a case of a shmichal of a soy program, because it's speaking where you put the vinegar into the grease in when they were cold, then you heated them up. So this is also a case of a shmichal of soy program. So once again, you don't have a raya, you don't see explicitly where Reb Meir says that even pogim mitchila is going to be also. Frank Gemara ubi pligi. You can't learn that the case of Yain Shenofal is a case of a shpichel of Seif Pogum, where Reb Meir Asers and Reb Shimon is Matir. You know why you can't learn it that way? Because the case before that already told us that Reb Shimon is Moide there. Umi pligi. Are you going to say that Reb Shimon is going to be Matir by a shpichel of Seif Pogum? Vokatani, we learned just a moment ago, Novel shall truma tchila. If the truma fell in first, which is a shpichel of Seif Pogum, divrei hakoil aser. Even Reb Shimon is money that it's aser. So if everybody agrees that by a shpichel of Seif Pogum that it's aser, the only place where there could be a machlokes is by Pogum etchila. So therefore, the case of yain shenafal techadoshim has to be when they fell when they were hot and they're Pogum etchila. Because the Brisa a moment ago already discussed the case of a shpichel of Seif Pogum, where the Brisa says even Reb Shimon is moida that it's aser. Elalav shmamina, it must be that the case of yain shenafal techadoshim must be Pogum meikara, and in that case, Reb Meir paskins that it's aser. And so you see there's a machlokes even by Pogum meikara shmamina. Now the raya that we see from here is a double raya. Sai we see that they're arguing by Pogum meikara, but we also see that in the case of a shpichel of Seif Pogum, there's no machlokes, even Reb Shimon is muddy that's aser. And we originally had a shaila in Rabbi Yochanan. Does Rabbi Yochanan say they're arguing even by Pogum meikara, but everybody agrees that a shpichel of Seif Pogum is aser? Or are they arguing in both cases? From this brisa, not only do we have a right or a Meir holds that Pogum etchila is going to be aser, you also have a right that a shpichel of Seif Pogum, everybody agrees that it's going to be aser. Shmamina. Zok Gemara, Hani Klos above Tani Lam. Now let's go back and analyze this brisa, because this brisa listed off a whole bunch of cases, right? The first case of the brisa was Naflu Ka'achas. The second case was where the Truma fell, where the Chulin fell first, and then I'm sorry, the middle case was where the Truma fell in first, and then the third case is with the wine. So we have three different cases. What is the special chiddush of each of these cases? So as Rashi says, plus above it, Reisha Hechad Naflu Ka'achas Vashmein Plukta Mitziyasa is Nafal Shal Truma Tchila, Above the Seifa is Yain Shenafel Chadoshim. The question is, why do you need all these three cases? So Zok to Gemara as follows. Hanitlas above the Ketanya normally. Bishlam above the Seifa. I understand the last case, the case with the wine, that's very important. That's where we proved our main thing from, that Reb Meir asers, even if it's pogim b'tchila. So that's a pivotal case, and we need that case to tell us the main focus of our discussion today, and that is Reb Meir asers even b'pogim b'tchila. What about Mitziyasa? Mitziyasa, we also need that case, because that's a case of his shpiach of b'soif pogim, that divrei kol. That's a very important case, because that tells us two important things. A, it tells us that a shpiach of seif pogum, even Reb Shimon holds it's aser, and it was only through that case that we knew that the third case is speaking by pogum b'tchila. El Reisha, the case where they both fell in together, the truma and the chulin, lo mali. Why do we need that case? What is the chiddush of that case that they argue? Uma seifa. Look at the seifa where it's pogum b'tchila. The loika mashbach klal, where there's no shvach at all. It was pogim mitchila. Nevertheless, Asher Rabbanan, the Rabbanan who we say is Reb Meir, says it's Asher by pogim mitchila. Reisha the kamashbach miboy. In the Reisha, originally at first, it was good for the mixture, and only later on did it go bad. So for sure there, Reb Meir would hold that it's Asher. So what is the chiddush of the first case of the price? Amar Abaye Zok Abaye Rachel Reb Shimon is. The chiddush is that Reb Shimon is matir. That's the chiddush. And this was the discussion between Reb Meir who answered and Reb Shimon who was matir. And they said Isazu ru'il lahachmet b'shtei shoyis. Normally, if you put in the right amount of yeast, it would take 2 hours for the dough to rise. Now, since we double dosed the yeast, it rose much faster. Mi garim lo shetachmitz b'sha'achas iser. So therefore, the original shvach, even though later on it might have turned bad, but the original shvach, that it fermented so much faster and rose so much faster, that shvach only came because of the added iser to this bunch, right? There was the fact that there was extra yeast over here. So the fact that there's extra yeast over here, the yeast of Truma or of Klai Kerem played a big role in that. So why don't we say that it's called a Shpiach L'Tchila that should be also? Reb Shimon will respond. It wasn't just the Truma that created the Shvach, it was the Truma, it was the Chulin as well. And Kishapagbu, Shneim Pagbu. So the suggestion here is that since the heter made the shvach and it would have made it independent of the iser, I don't call that the iser was mashpiach. Right? Gemara, why not? L'Rab Shimon litztar of heter v'iser b'hadei adoti b'litzer. The fact of the matter is that if it wasn't for the fact that you had the Isser here, what would have happened? What would have happened is after 1 hour of a normal dose of yeast, you have dough that's nishtahi nishtaher. It's half fermented. That's not good at all. That would be gam. And what happens is the fact that you had a second dose made it that after an hour, it was already in the perfect state of fermentation. It rose beautifully. So if that's the case, the Isser is the one that caused it to become good. So Oibazoi, according to Reb Shimon, it should also be Isser. So to Gemara, that's true, but Reb Shimon has a wild card. Reb Shimon l'tamei, the Amar afilu Isser ve'Isser nami loivin starfi. Reb Shimon holds that you cannot say that since the combined effort of the yeast of Truma together with the yeast of Chulin made it that lechatchila should ferment wonderfully, you cannot make that aser. Because Reb Shimon holds the only way an Isser will aser a mixture is if the Isser could do it completely on its own. Never mind in our case, where it needs to join forces with the heter. But even if it needed to join forces with another Isser, it wouldn't be mitzaref. So even if you had a unit of yeast of truma and a unit of yeast of klai, they wouldn't be mitzaref. The iser itself, one item alone, has to be able to be mishabeach it, and if not, it's considered pogum. So Rav Shimon Tamei the Amar afilu iser ve'iser nami loy mitzarefin. Where do you see the two yisurim will not be mitzaref to aser mixture? In Tanan we learned ha'arla uklai mitzarefin. If a half a shear of orla and a half a shear of klai fall into something, they would be mitzaref to aser the mixture that they fall into. But Rav Shimon Amar ein mitzarefin, they would not be mitzaref. Now orla and klai we know they're not bottle b'shishin. They're bottle only if they're less than 1 in 200. So Rashi tells us orla klai mitzarefin, meaning im naflu shneim lepachos mimasayim. So let's say the orla alone, had it fallen into the mixture, would not have been enough to aser. That would have been outnumbered by 200 to 1. And if the klai fell in by itself, it would have also been outnumbered by 200 to 1. The fact that they both fell in doesn't aser. We keep them each individual, and each one is bottle in the mixture. So you see, Rav Shimon knows even 2 Yisurim will not be mitzaref. Surely Isser will not be mitzaref, but heter to aser. So we learned today a whole bunch of new halachas. We have the shayla of nois and tam lefgam, and we have the machlokes ulan Rabbi Yochanan. Does Reb Meir aser nois and tam lefgam even if it was pogim b'tchila, which is what Rabbi Yochanan shita is, and we have ula shita is that Reb Meir only aser nois and tam lefgam if it was a shpiachol of soif paga. Then we have a machlokes as if to a mixture, the Isser that fell into the mixture, it's pogim it in one way, but it improves it in another way. So yeast of Isser fell into a mixture, and you can't eat it anymore because it was pogim it lachila. But now it makes this whole dough into yeast, so it benefits in another way. Reb Shimon holds that's mutter because you look at it like it's pogim because it's not edible anymore. Yet Reb Meir looks at it like it's mishabeichet because you look at the big picture. It was mishabeichet in this way. That was the second machlokes. And the third machlokes that we learned today is that Reb Shimon holds that you will never be mitzayir of 2 yisurim in a mixture. You look at each isur on its own to see if it will be overwhelmed by what it fell into, if it will be bottled. And you don't look at them joining forces. Where at Meir holds, you do look at them joining forces, and therefore, even if together with the heter, the isur needed the heter to be mishabeach, that would also be considered that it won't aser the mixture. So those are the 3 halachas we learned out of this shak levitarian. Zok Gemara, a very fascinating shayla. Hu achra, a mouse that once fell, the nafal lechavita de shechra. So a mouse fell into a barrel of shecher. So the mouse is osir, it's a sheretz, one is not allowed to eat it. Fell into a barrel of shecher. I guess there was not enough shecher to be mevatel the achbar. The question is, does it become osir? So the first question that you would ask is, take it out. What's the problem? Didn't cook it. So Tosfos says it's talking about a case where it was left there for 24 hours. That's called kavush. And kavush is just like bishul. If we look at the Tosfos, it's the first Tosfos in the wide lines. It's a simple, small, one-line Tosfos. Tosfos says, Tema, da tzayin b'tzayinu. Both are cold. The shecher is cold, the mouse is cold. Velishri, why would it be osir? Yishlemer the mayri shesha sham yoim or yomayim. The mouse was in that barrel of beer for a day or 2. Therefore, by a kavish b'seich shecher, we consider it kavish, which is k'mevushal, but kavish are k'mevushal, and that's where there was a shayla. Will it be able to ask? Imagine that somebody would be interested in drinking that. I wonder what the FDA would say about that. So Osrei Rav Lahushich. Rav held that the whole thing, the whole vat is going to be Osir. Amru Rabbanan Kamed Rab Sheshes. And they said over the psak of Rav, who answered this jug of Shecher to Rab Sheshes. Nema Kasavar, the item told Rab Sheshes, it seems like from Rav's psak that he holds nois and tam of gam Osir, because a mouse surely is nois and tam of gam, and yet Rav answered the whole barrel. Amar Rab Sheshes, no, you don't have a raya that is the sheet of Rav. You know why? The almost over Rav noit and tam of gam is mutter. by every normal Isser, Rav holds that nois and tam lefkam is going to be mutter. Why by a mouse was he answering, even though it's nois and tam lefkam? Because by a mouse it's different. Even though b'cholat harkula, nois and tam lefkam is mutter, by a mouse, by a sheretz, nois and tam lefkam is osir. Why would I say that? Because v'hacha chidushu, when you're talking about mice and shrotzim, it's a chiddush. Why? The hamimis mois udila in shimine. Why does the Torah need to create an isser for shrotzim? They're disgusting. Nobody would want to go near them anyway. As Rashi says, the hamimis ubelav ashara. Even if the Torah didn't say that a sheretz is tamei, a sheretz is aser, by nature it's repulsive. V'deil in shimine. So there was no reason for the Torah to ask for something that people wouldn't have went near anyway. Shemami no, from the fact that the Torah would out of its way to ask for something that no one would go near anyway. Shemami no, you see from here, afilu nois and tam lifgam osir. It must be that the Torah is answering the mouse, even though it's nois and tam lifgam. So yes, normally nois and tam lifgam is mutter, but the reason why Rav might have answered this barrel of shechar is because nois and tam lifgam by a sheretz is going to be osir. That was the comment that Rav Sheshes made. So this struck a question in my mind, because I remember learning a Gemara, although I don't remember where, that there are certain Isurim that the Torah gave us that we wouldn't have a minute to be over anyway, such as eating shkotzim or ramasim. Yet the Torah gave us and prohibited, why? To give us schar for not violating these Isurim. I think I remember learning such a Gemara, but from what the Gemara is saying over here is the fact that the Torah asked with mice, even though somebody wouldn't eat it anyway, must be that it's also even by nois and tam of kam. Actually, that's not a kasha. Not a kasha. The both comments fit perfectly together. In fact, the Torah might have asked it, even though someone is me'isi to give a schar, but the fact is that it must be that it's also even in the case of nois and tam of gam, because it's always nois and tam of gam. So therefore, it must be that shrotzim are also even by nois and tam of gam. A very big hiddush. Zok to Gemara, Amrle Rabban le Rav Sheshes. So the Rabban told Rav Sheshes. So now that you're telling me that shrotzim are different, and they're not osir because of the taste that they add to it, they're just osir because of this gzeres hakosov, that they're osir el me'ata l'tamei lach v'yovish. We know the halacha is that once the sheretz dries up, it's no longer metama. Now, if it's totally in, if it's a bliya, if we can use it, okay, so then I can understand the distinction between lach and yovish. But about this whole iser and tumah of a sheretz is all a chiddush. So then what's the difference if it's lach or yovish? Allah matnan, why did we learn metamin lachin, ve'ein metamin yovesh? The Brisa tells us that they're metamin lach, but they're not metamin yovesh. Elamai is lach lamemer. So what are you going to be forced to say? Shechva zera amor achmana b'ru'uya lazira. There's a gzeres hakosov. Just like shechva zera is only metama when it's wet, when it could still be mazriya, when it could still be potent. Hachanami, when the Torah talks about the Isser of Shkotzim, it says b'moisam, when they die. Amar Achmana kein moisam. They're only going to be metama when they're in the same condition as they are right when they die, fresh, soft, moist. So it's a gzeres hakosov that's when they're also. Zokt Rashi, Ella shiny linyan tuma. You have to say linyan tuma. Afal gav the chidushu, even though tumah is a chiddush, it's all gzeres hakosov. Gzeres hakosov he the lach v'lo yovish. There's a gzeres hakosov. It says kol hashiyipel olav mehem b'moisan ke'ein moisan ke'shehin lachem. So you see clearly that this is all part of the gzeres hakosov. That it could be a special gzeres hakosov that it's also even nois and tam of gam, and therefore you don't have a raya that Rav holds that nois and tam of gam is also. And there's a gzeres hakosov that it's only when it's moist. Yes, it doesn't have to make sense to us. Are mice disgusting? Mice are even served by a king's palace. So I guess Rabbi Simon ben Yaddo must have known that they served mice, but to a king. He must have had a Mouseh Shehaya. He must have seen a Mouseh where they actually served a mouse to a king. So how can you say it's paigim? It's not paigim at all. Zok to Gemara, Omar Rabbi Simon ben Yaddo, he answered his own question. Lo kashe, habedidabra habedamasa. A mouse that you find running around the city, that's disgusting. That they would never serve to a king. And that's the mouse that we're discussing over here. That's a chidush. And therefore, it's also, even if it's nois and tam of gam. The mouse that they serve al shulchan melachim, that's a mouse from the midbar. That's a mouse that's in the wild. I don't even know if that's called a mouse. Rashi says a squirrel. I wonder if that means a squirrel. But whatever it is, it's not something that's disgusting. Gewaltig. So to Gemara. So now we really don't know Pshat and Rav. So Omar Rava, Hilchos HaNois and Tam of Kam is mutter. We pass on Allah Lamaisa the Nois and Tam of Kam is mutter. We also pass on that Achbar of a Shechra. If a mouse falls into Shechar, we know it answers, but we don't know why. We don't have clear the reasoning for Rav. Lo Yadana my time of the Rav. Is it imishum the kasover nois and tam of kam aser? And then less halachas say, if the reason for Rav answering the barrel of wine of shechar is because he holds nois and tam of kam is aser, well then we don't pass like him because we know that we pass nois and tam of kam is mutter. Or maybe the reasoning for Rav answering the barrel of shechar is imishum the kasover nois and tam of kam is mutter, but the achbar b'shechra ashbuche mashbach. But Achbar in Shecher is a Shvach, not a Pgam, and maybe that's why Rab answered, and then we could pass like him. Okay, Baruch Hashem, we almost finished Daf Samach Ches. Be'ez Hashem, tomorrow morning, once again on Zoom, we will learn Daf Samach Tes. Everybody should have a wonderfully awesome day.